It's 1974. World War II was long over. Some people were already watching color TV, and cars looked like muscle machines. The Beatles had even broken up. But deep inside the dense jungles of the Philippines lived a man stuck in time for over 30 years, dressed in tattered World War II uniform and carrying a rifle from the 1940s. He was still hiding, still scheming, and still fighting a war that ended nearly 3 decades earlier. This isn't a made-up story or a movie plot. This is the unusual true-life story of the shadowy figure in the jungles of Philippines, who the locals called Ang Tulisan. In 1941, shortly after Hitler invaded Poland, the Imperial Japanese Army invaded the Philippines after bombing the Hawaii naval base of Port Harbor. The Japanese invaded the Philippines not because they needed their land, but because the Americans could launch their missiles against Japan from the islands of the Philippines. So in order to defend their homeland, they needed to sabotage the plans made by the Filipinos and Americans on those islands. This was when they decided to create a special team designed to terrorize, ambush, raid, and use different kinds of tactics to win the war. The leader of this elite team was a young man named Hiroo Onoda. Hiro was conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army exactly 1 year after the Japanese invasion. He was a young, fiercely loyal intelligence officer and was well trained in the task he was about to take on. So on the 26th of December, 1944, with World War II nearing its bloody climax, Hiro and his men were sent on a mission to Lubang Island in the Philippines. His orders were brutally clear: carry out guerrilla warfare ruthlessly. This meant they were to sabotage enemy plans and gather intelligence. And above all these, he should never surrender and never take his own life. He and his team are to stay alive until the Imperial Army returns for them. With these orders in heart, Hiro set out with his team to the island. But nothing could prepare Hiro for what he was about to face. His arrival on the island ruffled many high-ranking officials. So at every turn, these higher-ranking officers sabotaged all the efforts of Hiro and his team. This ultimately made it easier for the United States and Philippine forces to recapture the island on February 28, 1945. And to make matters worse, all the other Japanese soldiers fighting on the island either surrendered or were killed, except for Hiroo Onoda and 3 other soldiers: Private Akatsu, Corporal Shimada, and Private Kazuka. Hiro, determined to follow his order to the very end, led the remaining 3 men into the mountains to hide and continue carrying out their mission. So when Japan surrendered in 1945, the rest of the world took a sigh of relief. The atomic bombs had fallen, cities laid in ruins, peace treaties were signed, but no one came for Hiro and the 3 men. The same Japanese military who gave them the mission and promised to come back for them had seemingly forgotten about them. Hiro spent years in the jungle with these 3 men, believing the war was still on. Hiro and his group survived on bananas, coconuts, stolen rice, and cattle. They also carried out guerrilla activities on villagers they believed to be the enemies, and often got into gunfights with police. They allegedly killed up to 30 civilians while in hiding. Then one day, from the dark undergrowth of Lubang Island, Hiro watched as American planes dropped leaflets declaring the war was over. The Americans did this because of the continued attack on civilians, but Hiro read them carefully, dismissed them as enemy propaganda, and refused to go home. Again, in late 1945, more airplanes dropped leaflets over Lubang Island with a surrender order from General Tomoyuki Yamashita of the Japanese 14th Area Army. Hiro and his group also carefully examined the leaflets, but decided they were fake and part of an enemy trick, and once again refused to stop the war. To him, the entire jungle was enemy territory, so they continued their mission till September 1949, when things started to change amongst them. One of the men, Private Akatsu, got separated from the group and then started to move on his own. But this didn't last long. He quickly got tired and surrendered to the Philippine forces in March 1950. Hiroo and the other two men saw this as a desertion and betrayal, so they became more careful. In February 1952, search parties followed. Loudspeakers blasted messages calling the remaining men home. Even letters and family photographs were dropped from the sky. But every time this happened, the men believed it was a trick, and it further hardened his heart. Over the years, Hiroo's small group of fellow soldiers dwindled. Corporal Shimada and Private Kozukan were killed during a shootout in a skirmish with Filipino police and locals. And by 1972, Hiroo was the only one left. Alone and abandoned, Hiroo lived like a ghost among the trees. Villagers lived in fear of the shadowy figure who they called Ang Tulisan, who raided their rice stores, stole livestock, and occasionally opened fire on those who came too close. While to Hiroo, every farmer was a potential enemy soldier in disguise. Every noise in the night was a threat. Every sunrise meant another day to stay hidden, stay alive, and wait for orders that would never come. The world moved on without him. Japan rebuilt itself into an economic superpower. The Beatles became global legends. Men walked on the moon. Children who had never known war grew into adults and had children of their own. And Hiroo, he sharpened his knife, cleaned his rifle, and waited. Suddenly, the sign he was waiting for came. But would he surrender? It was the 20th of February 1974. A young Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki, with a heart full of wanderlust and a list of impossible quests, declared to his friends, "I'm going to look for Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order." No one took him seriously because they all thought Hiroo Onoda was dead, but Norio was very serious, so he departed from Japan and arrived at Lubang Island in February 1974. Against all odds, Norio found Hiroo deep in the jungle after just 4 days of searching. Norio was smart, so he did not confront Hiroo like the villagers or military did. Instead, he approached him like a friend, sat with him, talked, and listened. But even with this approach, Hiroo refused to surrender, not without official orders from a particular man, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, a retired commander of the Special Intelligence Squadron of the 14th Area Army. So Norio returned to Japan and reported to the Japanese government with proof that Hiroo was still alive. He also informed them that Hiroo will only surrender if he receives new orders from Major Yoshimi. The Japanese government immediately swung into action and tracked down Major Yoshimi, who was by then a bookseller living a quiet civilian life. They quickly flew Major Yoshimi and Norio back to Lubang Island in the Philippines. And on March 9, 1974, wearing his tattered uniform from 30 years ago, holding the same rifle he'd carried since 1944, Hiroo stood at attention and received his long-awaited orders. "You are relieved of all duties. The war is over." For the first time in nearly 30 years, at the age of 52, Hiroo laid down his weapon and ended his terror on poor villagers. When he emerged from the jungle, journalists, military officials, and a confused world stood watching in shock. Some saw him as a national hero. Others questioned the cost of his blind loyalty. After all, during his time in hiding, Hiroo had killed dozens of innocent Filipinos, believing them to be enemy combatants. But no matter how people felt, one thing was undeniable. He had become a living symbol of duty, resilience, and the terrifying power of belief. The then Philippine president, Ferdinand Marcos, out of pity or admiration, granted Hiroo full pardon for all the crimes he committed while hiding. And Hiroo offered his military sword to the president and returned back home to a warm national welcome. The Japanese government offered him a large amount of money in back pay, but he turned it down. He wrote a best-selling book that same year titled No Surrender, My 30-Year War. But Hiroo struggled to adapt to post-war life. The noise, the crowds, the overwhelming speed of modern Japan, none of it made sense to him. So he eventually moved to Brazil, got married at age 54, and lived as a farmer before returning to Japan much later. In the end, Hiroo Onoda died in 2014 in Japan at age 92. But his story continues to linger, a strange, heartbreaking, and mind-bending chapter in human history that forces us to ask, what happens when your mind refuses to accept that the world has changed? And how long can one man stay at war? Even long after the war is gone,